So now we are going to tackle a very important topic in chess, which is that of optimizing your pieces. And in fact, we're also going to discuss optimizing your pawns. So it might be fairer to say that this is optimizing your entire army. What do we mean by optimizing? Well, put simply, a knight is not necessarily worth the same as your opponent's knight. Or your bishop may be worth more or less than your opponent's bishop. Or in fact, one of your bishops might be worth more or less than your other bishop. And this goes for every piece and also the pawns in your position. Ultimately, the points system that we use is just a guideline. This is, in fact, the explanation for why sometimes it makes sense to sacrifice an exchange, for instance, because if we say that a rook is worth 5 points and let's say bishop or a knight is worth 3, then, it would never make sense to just sacrifice if these were concrete, unbreakable point system. It would always be a losing proposition. But we know that that's not the case. They're only guidelines. And what matters more than these kind of guiding values is how much each piece or each pawn is worth in any given specific position. So what I'm going to do for this section is I'm going to show you through games. I'm going to talk about several key points. And the first two topics that I'm going to discuss is number one, pawns, right? And the typical things that you want to do that allow your pawns to gain in strength. And simultaneously, I'm also going to be looking at how to optimize your bishops in general. So what you want to achieve with them in order to raise their value, so to speak. So this first game, we will be focusing on pawns and bishops. And then afterwards, we will still be covering knights. We will be covering rooks. Typically, for instance, knights wish to be central and stable. Rooks typically want to be active, especially on the 7th rank, and they wish to be connected. We'll have a few things to say about the queens and optimizing them. And we'll even discuss what you wish to do or what you should generally do with your king. But for now, let's begin by looking at pawns and bishops in this classical game played many, many years ago, at this point almost 200 years ago. Very famous game between Alexander MacDonald with the white pieces and Louis Charles de la Bourdonnais with the black. White started with the move e4, and we have a Sicilian on the board. White and black both brought out their knights. d4, pawn takes, knight takes, e5. We're going to go a little bit fast here. And here, MacDonald makes what nowadays we understand to be a mistake. He captures this knight. And now, what we want to focus on is what occurs with the pawns here. Well, black can recapture in one of two ways, but he very cleverly recaptured with the b-pawn. And this, we see, has an immediate effect on both the pawns, primarily. Notice now there's a greater pawn mass in the center for black, and it also has an effect on his bishop here on c8, because notice that the bishop on c8 is eyeing up two diagonals initially. This diagonal from c8 to h3 or from h3 to c8, and this other diagonal from a6 to c8. So both of them, of course, begin closed, but now one has opened up. So the bishop has the possibility of activating itself on one of these two squares and occupying either the f1 to a6 diagonal or the longest diagonal on the board, which is the h1 to a8 diagonal, or a8 to h1, whichever perspective you wish to take. White therefore should not have allowed this, because it's helping black not only to activate his bishop to optimize it, but also pawns usually want to be in the center. So this migration from b7 to c6 will generally favor black. The other point as well that should be mentioned is in this position here, we can talk about number of pawn islands. So a pawn island, for those of you who are not familiar with this term, you can understand why they call it a pawn island. It's any massive pawns that are all kind of adjacent to each other. So here we see there's a pawn on h2, one on g2 again, one on f2, one on e4. No pawn on the d file. So therefore we can say that's one pawn island, and let's now look at the second pawn island here. In chess you want to have as few pawn islands as possible because then the pawn chain sort of protects itself, right? Let me give you, for example, in this position, let's say after b takes c6, which was played, I certainly don't recommend this, but I just want to show you a variation, right? Just to illustrate one point. This is a very bad idea to put your pawns like this in this specific position because you would be leaving yourself with a lot of weaknesses on these surrounding dark squares. So this would not be a good idea. But what I want to illustrate is that the pawns being like this, compact in one island, means that they support each other, right? And so only this pawn here on g2 needs to receive the support of a piece, in this case, the bishop on f1. And then the g2 pawn will act as the base for the remaining pawns, and so they're kind of less vulnerable. Whereas if you have more isolated pawns, doubled pawns, etc., then they cannot defend for themselves. So that is one of the big reasons why you want to avoid having too many pawn islands, having too many pawns separate from the other pawns. So we notice, in fact, that here, if we just drop back, after knight takes c6, b takes c6, well, white has not actually increased the number of pawn islands for black, nor has he reduced them. They were previously the first pawn island running here, then no pawn on the c file, so the second pawn island here, and after knight takes c6, b takes c6, we still have the same number of pawn islands. However, one subtle change has occurred, and that is that this particular pawn chain is now made up of 6 pawns, while there is only one pawn here. So it's a 6 and 1 distribution versus a 5 and 2. And in general, this is beyond the scope of this section, but in general, you can take my word for it that these kind of longer, more compact pawn chains are to be preferred. So this gives a slight structural advantage. Now, when I say take my word for it, I don't mean indefinitely take my word for it, but for sure this is something that will be discussed in the future. So, therefore, there was a little bit of an improvement in the pawn structure for black. Now, white now goes bishop to c4, and notice that desire to optimize his own bishop. Bishops are long-range pieces, and they want to be on a very good diagonal. So there are a few diagonals that are good. One of the options is the longest diagonal for the light-squared bishops on f1 and c8 respectively is, sure enough, the h1 to a8 diagonal. However, in this case, it wouldn't make much sense for white to go something like pawn to g3, let's say knight f6, and now bishop to g2, because given the placement of this pawn on e4, the bishop on g2 is not really doing much of a job. In general, you don't want the bishop pointing at your own pawn, right? This would reduce this bishop to a defensive role, and that's certainly not what you want to achieve. Therefore, white has to think, well, what diagonal is good for my bishop? And it's quite clear that, if you place your bishop on d3, you'll be hitting at this pawn. If you place your bishop on b5, well, you will lose the bishop, same for a6. So really that leaves e2 or c4. And it's clear that bishop on c4, it's on the longer of the two diagonals than the bishop on e2. And it's also additionally striking at this classically weak point, the f7 point, which is only defended by the black king. Black proceeds with development of his knight to f6. And now white goes bishop to g5, again activating his bishop. In this case, he could have placed it maybe on e3. That would have been quite a nice diagonal. But his idea is to try and take advantage of one of the big methods that you can use to put your opponent under pressure, and that is to pin your opponent's knights to either the queen or to the king, or sometimes to a rook, to anything that is worth more, so that it ties the knight down. Black breaks the pin quickly. In this case, he could have chosen a more active diagonal for his bishop, but he decided that it was better to place the bishop on a more passive position, but importantly, completely breaks the pin. White now went queen e2, and now black pushed his pawn. So this is the next thing on pawns that I want to mention. Pawns, in general, they want to be in a central position and they want to be connected. So we see here that black is achieving both of those, and therefore his pawns will allow him to grab central control. Most of the time, all else being equal, will give you an advantage. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and the bishop drops back to b3. Castle, castle. And now, notice how black wants to do something with this bishop. But he could, and it wouldn't have been a bad idea, he could go to e6. In this case, the bishop wouldn't be on any especially good diagonal, but it would serve to take the sting from the pressure that this bishop exerts on d5 and even on the king and on f7, as it is x-raying these points. So bishop to e6 would have been an interesting move. But black instead went pawn to a5, and with this move he clears the rooks, control both a7 and a6. And importantly, a6 means that black in some situations may be able to play bishop to a6. And this is in fact the best diagonal, or one of the best diagonals that black has for his bishop, right? Because if he tries to develop the bishop this way, we've already mentioned e6, but we see f5 is not an option, g4 is not an option, and h3 is certainly not an option. White now reacts with pawn takes d5, c takes d5, and rook to d1, pressuring that strong central pawn mass. Now, there's one thing that I also want to mention, and that is that pawns, when they are in the center, are usually quite happy to be on opposite colors like this. So the e5 pawn is on a dark square, while the d5 pawn is on a light square. And the reason why this is useful is because the pawns together, they combine very well to control a lot of squares. However, after one pawn commits to the same color, right, moves forward, and now they're both on the dark squares, that really reduces the control of the light squares, and it makes the job easier for the opponent because it gives him more play along this particular set of squares. So that is one of the downsides of putting your pawns like this. On the other hand, here black is pretty happy because one of the important things to do with pawns is to advance them. And you don't want to just sort of advance them carelessly where they get hoovered up by the opponent, but you want to advance them in a way that they are quite advanced, but they are also supported by other pawns, right? And we see this pawn majority here in the center where black has a pawn on the e file and a pawn on the d file. And white doesn't even have one pawn to challenge on those two files. And of course, the reason for this is, if we remember, that b7 pawn, it was encouraged to come to c6, then to d5, and now finally to d4. So this is something that white should have been more careful about allowing. Now, white makes a big mistake and he goes pawn to c4. And by doing this, he now cannot challenge this pawn on c3, unlike if he had done pawn to c3 immediately. So after pawn goes to c4, we now see two very strong connected central passed pawns. On top of this, the pawn on c4 locks this bishop, right? So we see that white is not really playing in accordance with the rules of chess, right? Or the principles of chess. And we'll see how he gets in trouble as a result. Black went queen to b6, white went bishop to c2. Now this makes sense, of course, activating the bishop along this strong diagonal. If queen takes pawn, that would be a disaster for black. Bishop takes h7. The queen falls. Classical discovered check theme. Now, we see that for now, the black pawns are unable to make further progress. So, well, black sets about the task of optimizing this bishop, which for now has not moved. And where does he place it? Of course, bishop on b7. This long diagonal is now a very, very good square for black to be on, the b7 square, as after the pawn went to d4, the diagonal opened up fully. White goes knight to d2. He's also finishing his development. Rook a to e8, knight e4. Now the bishop is being attacked, so he has to move it. Bishop d8, c5, and now queen to c6, setting up a battery which ties down this knight, because if the knight moves, it will be checkmate. So white has to play f3 here, just to lock down the diagonal and defend the g2 pawn, because otherwise f5 was going to win the pinned knight. Black now goes bishop to e7, targeting this point on c5, rook c1, and now this pawn mass cannot move by itself, but we now understand why black chose to bring the rook from the a file to e8 and not the other rook to e8, and that is because f5 was his intention all along. Now we see that connected pawn mass really starting to be intimidating. Queen c4 check was played, king h8, and now the bishop, which is not really doing much of a job here at all, we see now how it gets activated, bishop to a4. And the consequence for black is that he loses an exchange. Queen to h6, bishop takes e8. But black had foreseen this and plays, rather than, the move that you might predict, you might imagine, his plan was to instead capture this central knight on e4. And in so doing, if we take the heart of the center to be these four squares, we see that black has three connected pawns on those squares, while white has none. And we're going to see how devastating that can be. White pushes his own pawn to c6, following the principle that we want to advance our pawns. We want to do so carefully, but of course the closer you are to the promotion square, the more dangerous that these pawns can be. And now black uncorks a very nice move. He plays pawn takes f3, completely ignoring this bishop on b7 that is being attacked. Now, the thing about it is that if white does grab this bishop, well, queen goes to e3 check, and now no matter where you go with the king, be it f1 or be it h1, let's say king to h1, f takes g2 check king takes g2, rook f2 check, and no matter where the king goes, the best bet is king g1, but rook takes b2, discovered check. And now king h1, queen f3 check, king g1, and queen g2 is checkmate. Notice that what was devastating for white was this move f takes g2, just completely cracking open the white king. But let's actually try and figure out where this pawn came from, right? It came before it was on f3, it was on e4. And before it was on e4, it was on f5. So we see that not only the benefits of centralization from the point of view of passed pawns being strong in the sense that they can promote, but we also see that as you centralize and advance your pawns, it can lead to situations where that pawn acts as a battering ram and just cracks open the king position. So that's very important. Now, therefore, after c6, e takes f3, white instead played rook to c2. This is actually quite a big mistake, and black's best way of exploiting this would have been with the very clever move bishop to a6. The bishop is undefended, so sure enough, white can and should take it. But the whole point is that the queen here is now a little bit out of play, and black will go pawn to e4, and this pawn mass actually means that black is in very good shape, very close to winning. Let's see what actually happened in the game. Black gave this check, and white now made a big mistake, king h1. He should have blocked with the rook, but it's easy to make mistakes under pressure. King went to h1. Now black dropped back with the bishop because he doesn't want to allow c takes b7, not mainly because he loses the piece, but more so because next move that pawn will be a queen. So bishop went to c8. Notice that the bishop on c8 is also very useful because it's on this long diagonal, and these squares are quite important. Notice the king is very vulnerable on a light square, and as is this pawn on g2. Bishop d7, and now black follows this principle of trying to advance your pawns in a supported and safe way. Pawn to f2. Rook went to f1, and now he continues to advance. Pawn to d3. This is very correct play. Rook c3. He now takes on d7, recapture on d7, and now after this exchange, he pushes the next pawn to e4. And we see that with every pawn push, the value of his pawns, they're becoming, to follow the title of this topic, they're becoming increasingly optimized, right, with every careful advance. Now white plays queen c8. He too wants to try and make something of his advanced pawn. Now he may, in some situations, capture the rook, and after bishop takes, push forward with the pawn. So if, for example, black were to play h6, the tables would turn. Queen takes rook, bishop takes, d8 queen, and now black is in trouble. He has just lost the rook, and that bishop on f8 is pinned. So therefore, black goes bishop to d8 just to cut off those threats, and notice, important play against this pawn, he blockades the pawn. It's quite easy to blockade a single pawn. It's not so easy to blockade three connected passed pawns. White now goes queen to c4, and here black bumps up the pressure with queen e1. The point is that if white captures, then pawn takes rook will be a new queen and checkmate. So black goes rook to c1. But here, black is not forced to move his queen. Instead, he plays the beautiful move pawn to d2. Now we see really the power of these pawns, that they are supporting the queen and in addition striking at this rook on c1. White plays the move queen c5, which is a little bit of wishful thinking. The idea is that if we capture this, then we are forgetting about the problems in our own position. Queen takes rook, checkmate. Black, of course, sees this and just plays rook to g8. Now rook to d1, and we have advanced these pawns as far as they can go, but there is one pawn left, pawn to e3. White is really completely tied here. He may be in exchange to the good, but clearly these are not ordinary pawns. These are worth far, far more than an exchange. White goes queen to c3, and here black chooses not only the strongest finish, but also, I think, the most aesthetic finish. He captures the rook on d1. Rook takes d1, and now here black plays the move pawn to e2, and this is really a very beautiful final position, very unusual. 3 black pawns have all arrived onto the 7th rank and threatening to promote, and although white is able to capture one of them, no matter what he does, he will be unable to prevent black from at least obtaining one queen, and because of the back rank mating problems, he will in fact be unable to avoid checkmate. So here white indeed resigned. So I hope that you enjoyed this game, which has been our full treatment of pawns and bishops and the most comprehensive coverage of the section. And now we will move on to examples covering the remaining topics. So hope to see you there.